The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. In the back row of courtroom 7, a woman in her mid-40s sat quietly, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Justice Maria Richardson had traded her usual ceremonial robes for a simple navy blue blazer and pencil skirt, blending perfectly into the crowd of everyday citizens. She'd been doing these undercover visits for weeks now, slipping into different courtrooms across the state like a silent observer. As the newly appointed Chief Justice, the first black woman to hold the position in the state's history, she believed in seeing the system through the eyes of ordinary people. Not as someone sitting high on the bench, but as one of the many faces in the crowd seeking justice. The wooden bench creaked softly as she shifted, jotting down notes in her small leather-bound notebook. Around her, people fidgeted nervously, clutching papers and whispering to their lawyers. An elderly gentleman to her right was rehearsing his statement under his breath, while a young mother in front tried to quietly calm her restless toddler. Maria smiled softly, remembering her own first day in a courtroom 20 years ago. She'd been a fresh-faced law school graduate then, her hands trembling as she presented her first case. Now, after decades of breaking barriers and challenging the status quo, she carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Every decision she made would ripple through the justice system, affecting countless lives. The court clerk's voice rang out, announcing the arrival of Judge Thompson. The room fell into a respectful silence as he swept in, his black robes billowing behind him. Maria studied his demeanor carefully, the way he arranged his papers, how he acknowledged the court staff, the tone he used to address the first case of the day. What caught her attention wasn't just his actions, but the subtle reactions of the people around her. Some seemed to shrink in their seats when his stern gaze swept across the room. Others straightened their spines, as if preparing for battle. These small moments told her more about the real state of justice in her courthouse than any official report ever could. She felt the familiar flutter of butterflies in her stomach, knowing that soon she would need to speak up. Not as Chief Justice Richardson, but as an ordinary citizen with a voice that deserved to be heard. It was a test, not just of Judge Thompson, but of the entire system she was now responsible for reforming. As she waited for the right moment, Maria reflected on her journey, from the small apartment above her parents' bookstore where she'd studied late into the night, to the prestigious law school where she'd often been the only black woman in her classes, to this very moment. Every step had prepared her for what was about to unfold. The morning light continued to climb higher, warming the room as the first cases were called. Maria listened intently, her pen moving across the page, capturing every nuance of the proceedings. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become a turning point in their state's judicial history. The weight of her hidden identity sat lightly on her shoulders, but the gravity of what she was about to reveal would send ripples through the entire courthouse. Sometimes, she mused, the most powerful lessons come when we least expect them, from people we never thought would be our teachers. The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. In the back row of courtroom 7, a woman in her mid-40s sat quietly, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Justice Maria Richardson had traded her usual ceremonial robes for a simple navy blue blazer and pencil skirt, blending perfectly into the crowd of everyday citizens. She'd been doing these undercover visits for weeks now, slipping into different courtrooms across the state like a silent observer. As the newly appointed Chief Justice, the first black woman to hold the position in the state's history, she believed in seeing the system through the eyes of ordinary people. Not as someone sitting high on the bench, but as one of the many faces in the crowd seeking justice. The wooden bench creaked softly as she shifted, jotting down notes in her small leather-bound notebook. Around her, people fidgeted nervously, clutching papers and whispering to their lawyers. An elderly gentleman to her right was rehearsing his statement under his breath, while a young mother in front tried to quietly calm her restless toddler. Maria smiled softly, remembering her own first day in a courtroom 20 years ago. She'd been a fresh-faced law school graduate then, her hands trembling as she presented her first case. Now, after decades of breaking barriers and challenging the status quo, she carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Every decision she made would ripple through the justice system, affecting countless lives. The court clerk's voice rang out, announcing the arrival of Judge Thompson. The room fell into a respectful silence as he swept in, his black robes billowing behind him. Maria studied his demeanor carefully, the way he arranged his papers, how he acknowledged the court staff, the tone he used to address the first case of the day. What caught her attention wasn't just his actions, but the subtle reactions of the people around her. Some seemed to shrink in their seats when his stern gaze swept across the room. Others straightened their spines, as if preparing for battle. These small moments told her more about the real state of justice in her courthouse than any official report ever could. She felt the familiar flutter of butterflies in her stomach, knowing that soon she would need to speak up. Not as Chief Justice Richardson, but as an ordinary citizen with a voice that deserved to be heard. It was a test, not just of Judge Thompson, but of the entire system she was now responsible for reforming. As she waited for the right moment, Maria reflected on her journey. From the small apartment above her parents' bookstore, where she'd studied late into the night, to the prestigious law school where she'd often been the only black woman in her classes, to this very moment. Every step had prepared her for what was about to unfold. The morning light continued to climb higher, warming the room as the first cases were called. Maria listened intently, her pen moving across the page, capturing every nuance of the proceedings. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become a turning point in their state's judicial history. The weight of her hidden identity sat lightly on her shoulders, but the gravity of what she was about to reveal would send ripples through the entire courthouse. Sometimes, she mused, the most powerful lessons come when we least expect them, from people we never thought would be our teachers. The tension in courtroom 7 had become thick enough to touch. People who had been dozing off during earlier proceedings now sat up straight, their eyes darting between the stern-faced judge and the composed woman who dared to challenge him. The small business owner's teenage daughter, who had been sitting quietly beside her father, began recording everything in her notebook, somehow sensing she was watching history unfold. "This is my final warning," Judge Thompson declared, his voice carrying that special kind of anger that comes when authority feels threatened. "Either sit down and remain silent, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." The young court officer shifted his weight from one foot to another, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He'd seen Maria's quiet note-taking all morning, had noticed how she helped an elderly man find his way to the right courtroom earlier. Something about this didn't feel right to him. Maria carefully withdrew a small book from her bag, a well-worn copy of the state's legal code. "Your Honor," she spoke with quiet dignity, "I draw your attention to Article 15, Section 3, which clearly states that members of the public have the right to provide relevant legal information during open court sessions, provided it pertains directly to the case at hand." A few of the lawyers present began nodding unconsciously. They knew she was right, but years of experience had taught them to keep quiet in Judge Thompson's courtroom. One of them began frantically texting under the table, likely alerting someone outside about what was unfolding. The small business owner's lawyer found her courage. "Your Honor, I would like to hear what this citizen has to say. It could be relevant to my client's case." Judge Thompson's face flushed darker. "Counselor, you will control your client's case, or I'll find you in contempt as well." His hands gripped the edges of his desk, knuckles turning white. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. A law student in the back row was showing something on his phone to his classmate, their eyes growing wide. An older lawyer near the front suddenly sat up straighter, recognition dawning on his face as he stared at Maria. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that undermines our justice system," Judge Thompson continued, his voice rising. I will not have the dignity of this court questioned by someone who clearly doesn't understand proper legal procedure. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Maria. She remained standing, calm as ever, like a stone in a rushing river. She'd seen this pattern too many times before. Qualified voices silenced, expertise dismissed, all because of how someone looked or where they came from. The court clerk was now practically jumping in his seat, still trying to get the judge's attention. He'd written 3 more urgent notes, each one ignored. A few rows back, an elderly woman who had been watching the whole scene unfold turned to her neighbor and whispered, "That judge is about to learn a lesson he'll never forget." Through the tall courthouse windows, clouds passed over the sun, briefly dimming the room. In that moment of shadow, several people noticed something they hadn't before. The quiet authority in Maria's stance, the wisdom in her eyes, the subtle way others in the legal profession were beginning to react to her presence. The small business owner's daughter had stopped writing and was now recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking slightly with excitement. Her father, who had been slumped in defeat earlier, now sat up straighter, hope returning to his eyes as he watched someone finally stand up to the system that had been wearing him down. Maria took another step forward, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom. "Your Honor, before you make your next decision, I believe there's something you should know." The young law clerk, who couldn't contain himself any longer, practically leaped from his desk. His sudden movement caught everyone's attention, including Judge Thompson's. The clerk's face was flushed with urgency as he hurried toward the bench, clutching a newspaper clipping in his trembling hands. "Your Honor, please, you need to see this immediately," the clerk whispered, his voice shaking with nervous energy. But Judge Thompson, already frustrated by what he saw as repeated interruptions to his courtroom, waved him away with an irritated gesture. "Not now," the judge snapped, focusing his attention back on Maria. "And you, madam, I'm giving you one last chance to take your seat before I have you removed from my courtroom." The clerk backed away, looking helplessly at Maria. He kept glancing between the newspaper in his hands and her face, then at his phone where the state judiciary's website was open. A few other people in the courtroom had their phones out now too, their eyes widening as they made the connection. "Officer," Judge Thompson called to the young court officer, "please escort this woman out." The officer took one uncertain step forward, then stopped. He'd just received a text message from a colleague outside the courtroom. As he read it, his face went through a remarkable series of expressions: confusion, shock, and then something close to awe. The officer stammered, looking between Judge Thompson and Maria. His hand, which had been reaching for his radio, dropped to his side. The small business owner's daughter, still recording everything, suddenly gasped. She'd been looking up court procedures on her phone when a news article popped up. She tugged at her father's sleeve, showing him the screen. His eyes grew wide, and he straightened in his chair, a smile slowly spreading across his face. The buzz in the courtroom grew louder. People were whispering, showing each other their phones, some even taking pictures despite the usual courthouse rules against photography. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically. What had started as tension was transforming into barely contained excitement. Maria stood calmly through it all, her expression patient but firm. She'd spent years in courtrooms just like this one, facing moments just like this. But today wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about something much more important: showing everyone in this room what real justice looked like. "Your Honor," the small business owner's lawyer spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "I really think you should." "Enough." Judge Thompson's voice boomed through the courtroom. "I will not have my authority questioned in my own." He was interrupted by the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom bursting open. The chief administrator of the courthouse, a man who rarely left his office during sessions, rushed in. His face was red from running up 3 flights of stairs after receiving multiple urgent messages about what was happening in courtroom 7. The chief administrator stopped short, trying to catch his breath as he looked around the room. When his eyes landed on Maria, they filled with a mixture of respect and concern. He knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, he knew what was about to happen. The room fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of paper shuffling and quiet coughs had stopped. Everyone could feel it. They were about to witness something unprecedented in their courthouse's history. Maria took another step forward, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She hadn't wanted things to unfold this way, but sometimes the best lessons came from unexpected moments. As she opened her mouth to speak, 20 years of experience, dedication, and broken barriers stood behind her words. The chief administrator cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the now silent courtroom. Your Honor, may I present Chief Justice Maria Richardson of the State Supreme Court. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of gasps and murmurs throughout the courtroom. Judge Thompson's face, which had been flushed with anger moments before, now drained of all color. His hands, which had been gripping his gavel tightly, went slack, and the wooden hammer made a soft thud as it rolled across his desk. The small business owner's daughter, who had been recording everything, almost dropped her phone. Her father reached out to steady her hand, his own eyes wide with disbelief. The video she was capturing would likely be viewed thousands of times in the coming days. A moment of truth that would change their local justice system forever. Judge Thompson started, then stopped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The authority he'd wielded so confidently just moments ago seemed to evaporate into the air. Maria walked forward, her steps measured and deliberate. The simple blazer and skirt she wore suddenly seemed to carry the same dignity as any judicial robe. As she moved, people in the gallery instinctively stood up, not because of protocol, but out of genuine respect. Please, everyone be seated, Maria said, her voice warm, but carrying the weight of her position. Including you, Judge Thompson. She gestured to his chair, from which he had half risen in shock. The young law clerk who had tried so desperately to warn the judge was now holding back tears of relief. The court officer who had hesitated to remove her was standing at attention, a mix of awe and embarrassment on his face. I've been visiting courtrooms across our state, Maria explained, addressing not just Judge Thompson, but everyone present. Not in my official capacity, but as what every judge should remember they once were, a citizen seeking justice. She picked up the small business owner's case file from the clerk's desk, scanning it briefly. When I raised my hand earlier, it wasn't to cause disruption. It was because I noticed something that could save this family's business, something that everyone in this room had a right to hear. The small business owner wiped tears from his eyes as his daughter squeezed his hand. Other people in the gallery were nodding, some openly crying. They'd all seen moments of injustice before, but never had they witnessed such a powerful response to it. Your Honor, Maria continued, turning back to Judge Thompson, whose face had now shifted from pale to a deep red of embarrassment. The power we hold in these courtrooms isn't really ours. It belongs to the people, to justice itself. When we forget that, when we let our biases cloud our judgment, we fail not just those before us, but the very principles we swore to uphold. The chief administrator stood by the door, beaming with pride. He'd been the one who had supported Maria's nomination for Chief Justice, and moments like this proved why. The elderly woman in the front row, who had predicted the lesson, was nodding satisfaction, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Now, Maria said, her voice taking on a gentle but firm tone, shall we revisit this case? This time, with all voices being heard. She turned to the small business owner and his lawyer, giving them an encouraging smile that seemed to fill the room with hope. The morning sun, which had been playing hide and seek with the clouds, suddenly broke through completely, flooding the courtroom with warm light. It felt like a new day was dawning, not just for this courthouse, but for justice itself. The next few moments in Courtroom 7 would be forever remembered by everyone present. Maria turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and compassion. What we've witnessed today, she began, isn't just about one judge or one case. It's about a system that sometimes forgets its true purpose. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with various people. The nervous law clerk, the small business owner and his hopeful daughter, the elderly woman who had predicted this moment. Every person who walks through these courthouse doors, she continued, whether they're wearing designer suits or work clothes, whether they speak perfect English or need a translator, whether they can afford a top lawyer or rely on public defenders, every single one of them deserves the same thing, to be heard. Judge Thompson sat in his chair, looking smaller somehow. The weight of his actions seemed to press down on his shoulders. His hands, which had wielded the gavel so forcefully earlier, now rested quietly in his lap. "Your Honor," Maria addressed him directly, her tone firm, but not unkind. "When you dismissed my voice without even considering what I had to say, you weren't just dismissing me. You were dismissing every person who has ever felt powerless in a courtroom. Every person who has ever had their knowledge questioned because of how they look or where they came from." The small business owner's daughter had stopped recording and was now taking notes furiously, understanding she was witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Her father sat straighter, hope returning to his tired eyes. But this moment, Maria's voice softened slightly, isn't about punishment. It's about growth. About remembering why we chose this profession in the first place. She walked over to the law clerk's desk and picked up the case file again. "Let's look at this property dispute the way it should have been handled from the start." She turned to the small business owner. "Sir, your family has run this restaurant for 3 generations, correct?" He nodded, his voice shaky with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor. My grandfather started it with just 4 tables and a dream." "And the development company," she continued, flipping through the papers. "They're claiming your lease expired last month." But what they failed to mention, she pulled out a specific document, is that under our state's Historical Business Protection Act, any family-owned business operating continuously for over 50 years has special considerations before displacement. The development company's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was information he had conveniently left out of his presentation. "This is why every voice matters," Maria addressed the room again. "Sometimes justice isn't about complex legal arguments. Sometimes it's about someone speaking up at the right moment with the right information." The young court officer, who had been too nervous to remove her earlier, now stood at attention with pride, understanding he had accidentally made the right choice in his hesitation. "Judge Thompson," she turned back to him, "I'm not here to shame you. I'm here because our system needs change, and change starts with acknowledging our mistakes. It starts with understanding that the real strength of our justice system lies not in silencing voices, but in hearing them all." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, but the atmosphere in the room had transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation was becoming something else. A moment of transformation, a chance for real change. People in the gallery watched as something remarkable happened. They saw justice not just being served, but being reformed right before their eyes. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about setting a new standard for how justice should work for everyone. The next few days at the courthouse buzzed with activity unlike anything the building had ever seen. Maria's office, usually quiet and formal, had become the center of a whirlwind of change. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of case files, each one representing a decision made in Judge Thompson's courtroom over the past 5 years. "We need to review them all," she told her team of law clerks who had volunteered to stay late into the evening. Every single case where someone might have been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. The young clerks nodded eagerly, understanding they were part of something historic. The small business owner's case had been the first to be properly reviewed. His daughter's video of the incident had spread through the legal community, not as a source of scandal, but as a powerful lesson in judicial reform. Law schools were already requesting permission to use it in their ethics classes. In her temporary office downstairs, Maria had set up a special hotline. If you've ever felt unheard in our courtrooms, the flyers read, we want to listen now. The phone hadn't stopped ringing. People called with stories from months, even years ago, times when they had crucial information but weren't allowed to speak. Each call is a chance to make things right. Maria told the volunteer law students who were helping to document the stories. They worked tirelessly, understanding that behind each phone call was a person who had carried the weight of injustice for far too long. The courthouse staff had noticed other changes too. The security guards were being trained in respectful communication. The front desk now had translators available. Even the seating in the courtrooms was being rearranged to make the space feel less intimidating to the public. One morning, a week after the incident, Judge Thompson requested a meeting. He knocked on Maria's office door, looking different from the man who had commanded Courtroom 7 with such harsh authority. His shoulders were relaxed, his face humbled. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, sitting down across from Maria. And a lot of reading. He placed a worn notebook on her desk. I've written down every time I can remember letting my biases affect my decisions. It's a longer list than I'm proud of. Maria listened as he spoke about his background. How he'd grown up believing authority had to be stern and unquestioning. How he'd never stopped to consider the voices he was silencing. I don't want to be that judge anymore, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She reached for a folder on her desk. I have something for you, she said, pulling out a proposal. We're starting a new training program. Not just about bias, but about really listening to people in our courtrooms. Would you help lead it? Judge Thompson looked up, surprised. You want me to? Who better? Maria smiled. You've lived through this change. Your experience could help other judges understand why this matters. That afternoon, Maria walked through the courthouse halls, noticing the small changes already taking place. The atmosphere felt lighter somehow. People smiled more freely. In one courtroom, she paused to watch a judge actually step down from the bench to better hear a soft-spoken elderly witness. Near the entrance, she spotted the small business owner's daughter giving a tour to her high school class. And this, the girl was saying proudly, is where I learned that justice isn't just about laws and books. It's about making sure everyone's voice matters. Maria smiled, knowing that the real work was just beginning. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but each small step, each reviewed case, each new policy was moving them in the right direction. The courthouse was becoming what it always should have been. A place where justice wasn't just a word carved in stone above the door, but a living, breathing reality for everyone who walked through it. The private meeting between Maria and Judge Thompson took place on a quiet Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the incident. They sat in her office, where the late afternoon sun cast warm shadows across the walls filled with law books and family photos. I've been doing a lot of soul searching, Judge Thompson began, his hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee. His voice was different now, softer, more thoughtful. Gone was the harsh tone that had once echoed through Courtroom 7. I keep thinking about all the voices I might have silenced over the years. Maria listened quietly, noting how the man before her seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. But it wasn't the aging of defeat. It was the kind that comes with deep reflection and personal growth. You know, he continued, staring into his cup, I grew up believing that respect came from fear. My father was a judge too, and I watched him rule his courtroom with an iron fist. I thought that's what justice looked like. He paused, a sad smile crossing his face. I never stopped to question it until now. Maria leaned forward, placing a folder on the desk between them. Tell me about your first case, she said softly. Not as a judge, but as a lawyer. What made you want to serve justice in the first place? The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his eyes grew distant, remembering. I was defending a family about to lose their home, he said finally. They were good people who'd fallen in hard times. The judge in that case, he listened, really listened, not just to me, but to my clients. He found a way to help them keep their home while still following the law. He looked up at Maria. Somewhere along the way, I forgot about that judge. I became what I thought I was supposed to be instead of what I knew was right. Maria nodded, understanding filling her eyes. We all have moments that shape us, she said, opening the folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them. These came from people who appeared in your courtroom over the years. Some had good experiences, others, not so much. But look at this one. She handed him a particular letter. It was from a young woman who had been in his court just a month ago. Despite his usual stern demeanor, he had shown unexpected kindness when she was struggling to express herself in English. You have it in you, Maria said gently. The capacity to listen, to understand, to show compassion. It's not about throwing away authority. It's about using it wisely. Judge Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he read the letter. I didn't think anyone noticed those moments, he whispered. People always notice kindness, Maria replied, just like they notice when it's absent. That's why this moment, this change you're going through, it's so important. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse steps where people were coming and going. Every person who walks into our courtrooms carries a story, she said. Some are fighting for their businesses, like that family last week. Others are fighting for their homes, their children, their very freedom. They all deserve to be heard. Judge Thompson joined her at the window. I want to learn, he said simply. I want to be better. That's why I'm not calling for your resignation. Maria turned to face him. Because sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons themselves. Together, they watched the sunset paint the courthouse in shades of gold and pink. In that quiet moment, both understood that true justice wasn't about power or authority. It was about humanity, about seeing the person behind every case number, about listening to every voice, no matter how quiet. Tomorrow, Maria said, we start training other judges, and you'll help lead the way. Your story, both the mistakes and the change, can help transform our entire system. For the first time in weeks, Judge Thompson smiled. A real, hopeful smile. He wasn't just being offered redemption. He was being given a chance to turn his mistake into something meaningful, something that could help others avoid the same pitfalls. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in Courtroom 7. The courthouse had transformed in ways both big and small. On this bright morning, Maria stood at the back of a packed training room, watching Judge Thompson address a group of newly appointed judges. I used to think justice was about power, he was saying, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Now I know it's about something much more important. It's about listening. The new judges leaned forward, captivated by his story. They'd all heard about what happened that day, but hearing it from him was different. In the hallway outside, a wall of photographs showed the changes of the past 6 months. There was the small business owner, standing proudly in front of his restaurant, which was now officially protected as a historical landmark. His daughter had started a youth program teaching other young people about their rights in the legal system. The courthouse itself felt different. Gone were the intimidating silence and stern-faced authority. Instead, there was a new energy, professional but welcoming. Signs in multiple languages helped guide visitors. Volunteer law students offered free consultations in the lobby. Even the security guards had been trained to greet people with smiles instead of suspicion. Maria walked through the building, stopping to chat with people along the way. She passed Courtroom 7, which had become something of a symbol. Law schools now sent their students there to observe, as it had become a model for how justice should work. Chief Justice, a familiar voice called out. It was the elderly woman who had witnessed everything that day. She was now leading the Community Advisory Board, helping make sure the courthouse remained accessible to everyone. You won't believe what happened this morning. Judge Thompson helped a young mother find childcare so she could attend her hearing. He's really changed. Maria smiled, remembering the angry man who had once commanded that courtroom. The transformation wasn't just in him. It had spread throughout the entire justice system. Other courthouses across the state had started adopting their training programs. In her office, Maria kept a special frame on her wall. Inside was the sticky note the young law clerk had tried to pass to Judge Thompson that day, along with the first page of the daughter's video transcript. Small reminders of how one moment of standing up for what's right could create waves of change. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as Maria walked into her last meeting of the day. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, and community leaders. On the agenda, expanding the reforms statewide. Judge Thompson sat near the front, his notebook open, still learning, still growing. 6 months ago, Maria began, we saw how justice fails when we forget to listen. Today, we're seeing how it flourishes when we remember to hear every voice. She looked around the room, seeing hope and determination in every face. Outside, the courthouse steps were busy with people coming and going. A group of high school students was getting a tour, led by that same business owner's daughter. And this, they heard her say, is where we learned that justice isn't just a word. It's something we build together, every day, by making sure everyone's voice counts. As the day drew to a close, Maria stood at her office window, watching the sunset paint the city in soft colors. On her desk lay reports showing reduced appeal rates, higher satisfaction from court visitors, and more cases resolved through fair hearing of all sides. But the real success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the stories. Stories of people who finally felt heard, of lives changed, of justice served not through force, but through understanding. The courthouse lights began to dim, but there was still work to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new voices needing to be heard, new chances to show that true justice belongs to everyone. And now, finally, they were ready to listen.